All right, I think we'll get started. Good morning, everyone. I'm Martha Whitehead. I'm Vice President for the Harvard Library and University Librarian. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you to Beyond Digitization, a virtual symposium to celebrate a final significant milestone for the Colonial North America at Harvard Library Digitization Project. This project started over 10 years ago as an idea. Bob Darnton, at that time Carl H. Forsheimer University Professor and University Librarian, who's now Emeritus University Professor, has said, and I will quote him, "When I first conceived of Colonial North America, I thought of it as a way to share Harvard's intellectual wealth with the rest of the world. It was one of my top priorities as soon as I arrived at the library. Along with other initiatives such as DASH, our open access repository, the Office for Scholarly Communication, and the Digital Public Library of America, I hoped it would contribute to the democratization of access to knowledge." So as part of the program today, you will hear how this idea became a reality, how it grew over the years and reached a milestone a few months ago with the completion of the digitization work. My own first encounter with the Colonial North America project took place just a few months after I joined Harvard Library in 2019, when I was invited to a meeting to discuss related digitization initiatives at several institutions. And I was really delighted to see so many friends there. And to quote Bob again, he said, "From the start, we sought insights from the Boston Public Library, the Massachusetts Historical Society, la Bibliothèque et Archives Nationales du Québec, the New York Public Library, and others about possible future collaborative work." So let me take a moment here to really thank Bob Darnton for spearheading this incredible work. So thank you, Bob. We're all very grateful for your inspiration and foresight. I'd also like to take a moment here to thank the staff from across the Harvard Library who contributed to making this project such a success. And of course, there are too many to mention, but I did want to recognize and thank all the staff who worked in the libraries and archives who provided content for this project, and the staff who worked on preservation, digital imaging, and the technical aspects of discovery and access. Clearly, without their efforts, this project would not have gone beyond that initial idea. So as the Colonial North America at Harvard Library project reaches this milestone that we're celebrating with this symposium, we've been thinking about the naming and the branding of the project. And in thinking about the content that has been surfaced, we're really struck by the broad overarching themes that it revealed. Themes that are so important to us in Harvard Library today as we seek to advance open knowledge on a foundation of equity, diversity, and anti-racism. So we're now referring to this project as Worlds of Change, Colonial North America at Harvard Library. And the new title, we think, really sums up two important points about the colonial period and the collections that we have represented from that period. There are multiple worlds at different scales represented, and the period is one of tremendous upheaval and change. So first, the word worlds. There is, of course, literally the world, the planet, the globe, which became both larger and smaller in the colonial period. The boom in global scale navigation and exploration brought an unprecedented level of contact between the peoples of the world. And nowhere was this more true than in the Atlantic world that tightly linked with, of course, far-reaching consequences, Europe, Africa, and the Americas, each with its own diversity of cultures and societies. The colonial period also brought into contact and, as we know, often conflict, different cosmologies or understandings of the world and humans' relationships to it. Not only did the world change, but people's conceptions of it shifted as well. And at a smaller scale, our materials also document the world most people experience in their day-to-day lives, one that extends mostly out to include their immediate surroundings. While business, politics, religion, and other realms of activity were influenced by global currents, all of these played out in very local contexts, making for many smaller worlds of activity and change. And of course, a significant portion of the world's population had their own world constricted by the realities of colonialism, including through enslavement and dispossession of lands. And all of this is reflected in the granular personal detail in the Colonial North America collections. And then secondly, the theme of change. So change took many forms. Change was often disruptive. European societies were upended by this period of political revolutions. Indigenous communities and polities in North America, South America, and the Caribbean faced intruders, both human and microbial, and millions of people from Africa were forcibly uprooted and enslaved. Sometimes change was syncretic too. In the colonial period, there was unprecedented contact between cultures, societies, economies, and ways of organizing people and their relationships. And the change that took place was not exclusively exploitive or domineering. Often people adopted parts of societies previously unknown to them while actively resisting other parts. So finding evidence of these changes and complicating our understanding of the period is really at the heart of Colonial North America, our project, and will be reflected in its title going forward. So Worlds of Change, Colonial North America at Harvard Library. And Worlds of Change also evokes where we are today in our thinking about, as Bob Darnton had put it, democratization of access to knowledge. Today, Harvard Library is aiming to diversify and expand access to knowledge under a broad banner that we're calling Advancing Open Knowledge. So in addition to stewarding vast collections and open digital content, we want to engage in building global networks that focus on surfacing a diversity of voices and perspectives from communities around the world. So the work of the past decade and the project that we're celebrating with the Symposium is really a wonderful foundation for us to build upon. So it's now my pleasure to introduce you to our keynote speaker, Karin Wulf, and today's moderator, Ross Mulcair. Karin Wulf is the Executive Director of the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture and Professor of History at William & Mary. She's completing 2 books for Oxford University Press, Lineage and the Power of Connection in 18th Century British America, and Genealogy, a very short introduction. Karin is an academic director of the international collaboration, the Georgian Papers Program, and co-founder of Women Also Know History, and a regular writer for the Scholarly Kitchen, the blog of the Society for Scholarly Publishing. Ross Mulcair is the archivist for outreach, research, instruction, and special projects at the Harvard University Archives. In his role, he's responsible for connecting faculty, students, and other researchers to the archive's rich, complex documentation of Harvard's past and present. Ross has worked on the Colonial North America at Harvard Library project in various capacities over the past 10 years, ranging from historical content expertise to digital architecture. So now let me introduce you to Karin Wulf, whose talk is entitled Digital Access and Making Early America Vast. Welcome, Karin.
Thank you so much, Martha. I appreciate that very much, that kind introduction and the opportunity to be here with all of you. Could I have the first slide? Thank you so much. So it is really a pleasure to be with all of you and to have the opportunity first to congratulate everyone who's worked to make this extraordinary project possible. A project like this is the work of many, many hands, many kinds of expertise, and doubtless a lot of project management software. Thousands, if not tens of thousands of emails and meetings. So congratulations on this wonderful achievement. And when I say a project like this, I want to be clear that this is a truly distinctive undertaking. I can speak from the experience of the Georgian Papers Program, a collaboration to digitize and disseminate the papers of the Georgian monarchs in the Royal Archives at Windsor Castle, about what kind of undertaking it is to get hundreds of thousands of pages of material onto the platforms and in front of the eyeballs of an eager research community and a very eager public. Conservation, imaging, cataloging, enhanced metadata, research inquiry, public programs, and so much more. These collaborative projects help us to reveal the intellectual infrastructure of our knowledge about the past. They spotlight the materials, yes, these wonderful, incredible materials, but also the processes of bringing them into a collection, into a digital architecture, and into scholarship and public understanding. The Georgian Papers is one archival collection, which is part of what makes it very powerful in ways that resonate with early North America. The focus on George III, for example, is entirely resonant with our emphasis on the 250th anniversary of American independence coming in 2026. But that's very different from pulling together the collections of Harvard's 15 libraries and archives that participated here to offer one unified Harvard Early American collection. And what that aggregation is making possible is what I'm briefly addressing today. So by the way, some of you may notice that I've used in my slides just a few, of the same materials that the curators and directors of the various Harvard libraries and archives selected to highlight for a program about what was then called Colonial North America 2 weeks ago. It was fascinating to see what captured the attention of folks who know these collections so well. And if you haven't had a chance to see that program, it is recorded and I highly recommend it. With nearly 700,000 pages of material, why on earth would I choose to spotlight some of the same few items as these curators? It's because I think that the different perspectives on and uses for specific materials is as important as the incredible volume of materials in what was then known as CNA as early as 10 minutes ago, I guess. Thank you, Martha, for that update on the naming. It's exciting. So in my brief time this morning, I want to emphasize 3 aspects of how digitization helps make early America vast. But first, what is vast early America? It is a social media hashtag, but it's also more profoundly a way of framing early America most capaciously. Could we have the second slide, please? Thank you. Vast early America is a framework for an expansive early American past. Fully continental. Actually, I think we're just a little ahead of ourselves. Could we go back one slide? Thank you. Great. Super. I'm watching my text rather than watching the slides. So vast early America is a framework for an expansive early American past, fully continental, including the Caribbean, its Atlantic and Pacific, African, Asian, South American, and European contexts. This is an early America that is foundationally indigenous, shaped by the Atlantic slave trade, as well as by European settlement, in which we understand the 18th century history of New Mexico and California and the Arkansas River Valley to be as much a part of our collective American history as Cambridge or Boston in Massachusetts and Williamsburg in Virginia. Seeing this more expansive early America, rather than the more traditional East Coast, largely British American focus, is also about more than geography. It's about methods for expanding our scope, for changing our perspectives. It's about seeing the fullest complexity of societies and the diversity of populations. So digitization of archival materials helps us to bring forth this more capacious, essential understanding of early America, in part through the sheer volume of materials we can bring to bear. For one thing, it helps us to put historical experiences across cultures and distance side by side. In the most obvious way, we can look at materials across space and or across time, as in these 2 examples of baptismal records from the mid-18th century from 2 very different early American contexts. On the left, a peek at the index of a record book for the First Church of Roxbury, Massachusetts, which lists baptisms and church membership, and on the right, a record of baptisms in one of the Jesuit missions in Baja California. So from one end of the continent to the other, we see the work of European empires and settlers and their emphasis on the forms of European Christianity. We could also highlight materials in the Harvard collection from one of the praying towns in Massachusetts for a more direct mission-to-mission comparison. So let's just imagine what access to this volume of material undigitized would require. I'm certainly old enough to be nostalgic for, and perhaps so deep into pandemic that I'm positively longing for, the thrill of a cart emerging into the special collections reading room with manuscripts I'd requested. In a really banner moment, more than a single box at a time might be on that cart, parked next to the library table, where a researcher can imagine days, weeks, even months of careful reading ahead, perhaps standing to put a manuscript notebook into a cradle, bending over it, turning to madly type notes, If you pre-printed a list of your requests, you're ticking each collection off with your library approved pencil as you move through the materials, hoarding your time, allowing yourself to request only the materials that seem most relevant to your work. And you would have scoured the catalog records to ascertain that relevance. If you, like me, work on people and subjects that seemed obscure or unimportant, either in the period you study or in subsequent eras of archival collection and cataloging and institution building and scholarly publishing, you start to understand the logic of the materials organization. You might start to understand, like me, that if you're interested in histories of family records, you'd rarely find them cataloged as such until relatively recently, but you can often find these records embedded in account books. So you request and review account books by the dozens, maybe sometimes even hundreds, if you're lucky enough to be at Baker Library, I guess, everywhere you go, into small and large archives, where you wait for that cart to roll out and you catch the archivist or librarian's eye, and you whisper thank you with excitement for what might be on it and revealed within the materials it holds. What the scale of digitization that we're experiencing now allows is the revelation not only of more about early America, but also much more about an equally vital subject, how we have traditionally and in fact continue to practice it, whether on those library carts or in our catalogs, in fact continue to comprehend it. Could I have the third slide now, please? Thank you. One of the most intensive methodological perspectives for studying this period is the emphasis on archival silence. The great Haitian scholar Michel Rolfe-Trouillot wrote in his analysis of the West's failure not just to credit, but even to see the Haitian Revolution in terms of a liberatory event on the scale with or beyond the American and French revolutions, that, quote, the presences and absences embodied in sources, artifacts and bodies that turn an event into a fact, or archives, facts collected, thematized, and processed as documents or monuments, are neither neutral nor natural. They are created. It is enormously difficult for us to locate people and subjects in the archival materials who were not, or which were not, significant for recordation in their own time, or who did not create the kinds of records themselves, which have been the building blocks of historical analysis of narrative. We have to find these people, these subjects, in rare occurrences in the margins of our archival collections. So here we have a midwife's account of a paternity declaration in 1727. It is one of just two in the Harvard collection, this one at the law school, the other at the Schlesinger Library. Paternity declarations like this were phenomenally regular. And of course, births and midwives' attendance at births were obviously even more so. But for all of even British America, midwives' records are incredibly scarce. The very regular stuff of life is almost never regularly the stuff of our records. From Sadia Hartman to Stephanie Smallwood to Marisa Fuentes, Black scholars of slavery and the enslaved in particular have been pushing against what Trouillot described as the silencing of the past. As Smallwood wrote, quote, for as long as it has been a subject of professional scholarship, American slavery has exposed the methodological limits of the discipline of history. These and other scholars have shone away toward finding the history in the margins, in the silences, excavating the names of enslaved people, for example, and aggregating across collections to find fuller histories of their experiences, their families, and what that means for our communities and our nation. The sophistication of these methods and their explication has been breathtaking and path-breaking. Could I have the next slide, please? There is another crucial feature of Trouillot's observation, however, which is not just the absences in the archives, but the presences. What were archives meant to be? What early America were they meant not just to preserve, but in Trouillot's terms, to create? Individual archival items have their own agendas, from plantation records which dehumanize, so they offer us names of enslaved women as they categorize and account for them as property assets, to that 1727 paternity suit, which tells us how midwives appear in the official record as witnesses in criminal or civil suits about the children of unmarried mothers and fathers. Of what does an archive consist? When he was writing his biography of Patrick Henry in the late 18th and early 19th century, the Richmond lawyer William Wirt was part of a wave of efforts to secure the history of the American Revolution. He was keen to be accurate. He was keen to use archives, by which he meant the papers of important men of the time and the public records of newspapers and the official records of the legislature and the court. The archives of early America have been shouting at us for centuries. They have been telling us that British America is enormously important, most important, that the public deeds of the powerful are more important than the regular deeds of the ordinary. They have been telling us that some people are named, but many are not, that indigenous people come into history in contact with Europeans in treaties or trade and not otherwise. Could I have the last slide, please? I have not said anything that archivists and librarians haven't been discussing and debating in national and international meetings and publications. The structure of knowledge that is inherent in collections underpins our histories. There are two, it seems to me, obvious opportunities here. The first is putting into action the recognition that from acquisitions to cataloging to platform to research to publication, we are in a collaborative endeavor across domains of expertise and professions to create our knowledge of the past. Embedding that collaboration in our work consciousness and practices has so much potential. And the second is even more important, which is sharing that perspective with an eager public. I give very regular public presentations to an often skeptical public audience about the inherent value of revisionism. Revisionism, I call it, why it's good for you, or revisionism, over the counter, no need for a prescription. All sorts of lame references to an observation I heard first from the great Civil War scholar Ed Ayers, which is that we all want revisionist medicine, and history actually is no different. We proceed toward new knowledge through new information, new methods, new perspectives. This is a very healthy process. So as we work to surface the collaborative nature of making historical knowledge across our areas of expertise and responsibilities, catalogers and researchers, conservation and digital humanists, publishers and new media, making the nature of that collaborative labor obvious, plain, central, even expected for public consumption is vital. The public needs new American histories. It has been ever thus, but perhaps especially obvious as we contend with the vestiges of 20th century memorials to the Confederacy. But the public really needs to share in understanding that process. In short, what Harvard Library's CNA, or rather Worlds of Change, has given us is nothing short of extraordinary. This is 700,000 pages of rich material about early America, a really almost impossible to describe collection. By making this material freely available, we can appreciate so much about early America, and I am so eager for what comes of this. But by bringing together materials across libraries and archives, this also allows us to better understand Harvard's early America. It lets us see that process of acquiring, collecting, and cataloging. It lets us see what Harvard has thought across time about what is early America. And this is an extraordinarily bold offering. It is visionary. As holding collections, libraries and archives, I believe, have a critical, perhaps even unparalleled role to play as we contend with our past. We need this history of history. It is the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Karin, for the fascinating talk, packed full of really important and interesting ideas, especially those about archival silences and archival shouting, which I really like. And both of those ideas, I think, are really important for us to keep in mind as we encounter these documents and think about this period over the next few days. So thank you for laying the groundwork that I think all of our panelists over the next few days are going to build on. We've got plenty of time for questions with Karin from the audience. So I'll remind people to put questions in the Q&A function on Zoom, and I will be happy to pass them along to Karin so we can have a conversation together. But before we do that, and to give you a little time to do that, I want to take a moment using my moderator's privilege here and offer up a general comment. So I assume that many people in the audience today were or now are familiar with Karin's work and are probably familiar with the vast early America concept generally. For those who hadn't heard of this conception of the people, places, and times in question, I just want to comment on how influential it has been and how central it has been to injecting new life into early American studies. As I was preparing for this event, I went back and read Karin's original blog post from the Omohundro blog from January 2016, where she introduced the Vast Early America hashtag and a general sketch of the idea. I also read the longer 2019 piece in Humanities Magazine, where she expands on the concept and its importance. What was shocking to me in reading these was their timing. The phrase Vast Early America, I was reminded, just had its 5th birthday a few months ago. I could swear that this was an idea that I was wrestling with in graduate school 13 or 14 years ago, studying early American history. And in some ways, I was doing this, as Vast Early America is partly descriptive, offering a nice 3-word phrase that encompasses decades of careful thinking about the period and its people. The triumph of Vast Early America, though, I think, is that it is prescriptive as well, or at least instructive. I know that for the Colonial North America project here at Harvard, over the past few years, we've really looked to Vast Early America concept as a model about how to talk about all of the materials we are making available, what stories are contained within our collections, and why they matter. So as Martha mentioned at the top of today's program, we've chosen the name Worlds of Change as our own 3-word argument for what is documented in the 700,000 pages of manuscript material we've made available. And I'll admit that that idea borrows much from Vast Early America. I suspect that we and others will continue to return to Karin's work, her scholarly work, as well as her general writings about the value of the humanities as this project officially enters the world. So that's my very long way of saying thank you, Karin.
That's incredibly generous. Thank you so much, Ross. If I could just say a couple of quick things in response, that's very generous of you. I hadn't thought about that fifth anniversary, and I have to say that Vast Early America happened literally across the same dining room table I'm sitting at right now, as I was just musing to my spouse over a morning cup of warm caffeinated beverage, and trying to express something. And you're absolutely right that this is, while that phrase may be 5 years old, it is built on decades of scholarship. And I think for many people in the field, it is that constant interaction between a public conception of early America as really lagging behind decades of rich scholarship, which shows us this much more complex place. And in fact, many of us would argue this much more complex place that gives us a better foundation for the nation we have now, a better understanding. So, I think about some of your colleagues at Harvard, Ty Miles, working on the Upper Midwest and revealing a layered history of Detroit that explains, of course, why there was slavery in the Upper Midwest. Anyway, there's so much to say about that scholarship. And the other thing I'll say too is that, I talked about the history of history, and our scholarship has its own kind of lineage of privileging British America. We've done some studies, and Claudio Sant did a really remarkable study of looking at the areas of focus of publication in the William and Mary Quarterly, the field leading journal. Back in 2008, he did this kind of wonderful visual representation of what the continent looked like if you just looked at the William and Mary Quarterly. And let me tell you that New England looms very large, and the rest of the continent is like a bit of seaweed hanging to the, kind of protuberance of New England there. But then the last thing I just want to mention is that it's not just decades of scholarship, it's also really innovative methodology. I mentioned slavery studies, and people like Hartman and Fuentes and Stephanie Smallwood and Jennifer Morgan, just extraordinary work that has helped us to understand the implications, not just of the silences in the archives, but of the violence of the archive. But I also want to note that equally important in reshaping this field, I think, is the work of Native American and Indigenous studies and the methodology that lets us see how history as a discipline and its traditional emphases on certain kinds of evidence have left us with this undernourished kind of early American field.
Thanks, Karin. If I can continue the discussion about methodology here, there is a question about sort of broadly your perspective on where is the field of early American history, speaking generally, headed, and sort of germane to this conversation, how, if at all, are digitized sources or digital projects shaping the trajectory of the field? How are methodologies changing or shifting as we look into the future?
Well, I think that one thing that digitization is doing is that it's changing our perspective on the scarcity of the historical record. So I was suggesting that we understand the shape of that record better by the kind of project. Not that there really is another one at this moment. You guys are really sui generis here, but this project really helps us see the shape of that record and what its focus has been and how it has delivered up to us a certain early America. But also, I think digitization changes us from a world of scarcity of, heading into the archives and getting little bits and scraps to really being able to see at scale across these materials and across different collections. I do absolutely understand that the next step here and the next vital step is connecting collections across bigger institutions. So Harvard too, as Martha was saying, whether it's the BPL, the Bibliothèque Nationale, whatever it is, once we're able to really see, so how many of these things do we have? We can pull scraps of material to illuminate more lives, but also to understand why there's scraps in that archive. So I think digitization is giving us extraordinary tools to see both, more carefully, but also to see in aggregate the shape of what we have created as a field.
Great, thank you. We have a question that is sort of a comment that has come in that I want to read because I have a question version of it to tack on to the end myself. So this says, as the head of collections at a state historical society, I do hope that universities will begin to recognize the importance of state, regional, and local collections of archives, which hold far more of the stuff of life in their record groups. Although Professor Wolfe said the very popular stuff of life is rarely the stuff of records, this is more true at university archives than it is for the historical societies and civil records. It would be wonderful to see more scholarly focus on those collections, especially if it helps sustain them. And that's a comment, and I'm going to add a question here, which is one that I was thinking about. So some of the institutions you listed on the final slide, the Harvard among them, the Newberry Library, the John Carter Brown Library, the Folger Shakespeare Library, are, to put it mildly, well-resourced. How do small institutions like historical societies or even individuals who might have family materials and family histories in their own personal collections fit into this digital landscape? Do these big projects from big institutions like this one risk drowning out important contributions from smaller ones? So I think that connects to the comment from the audience member.
So I think there are at least 3 different questions in there. And one of them is about public archives. And gosh, that's such a great question. The point I was trying to make about how archives really shape our knowledge and understanding, I want to make a comment about the Alabama State Archives, which at the end of last year issued an extraordinary statement. I wish I had it to hand because I would read from it directly, about how that public archive had collected materials that created and emphasized and undergirded a narrative about the Confederacy, and that they understood their public mission to be different, and they were reflecting on how that had proceeded. So I just an absolute model, and it was just a kind of a stunning moment to note that public institutions too take shape with collecting priorities and so on. But having said that, of course, as a person who has often worked on women, on people who are poor, that public institutions have been the mainstay of my research, and those institutions are wildly under-resourced. It is a terrible, terrible thing. And I don't just say that because I'm a historian who likes to go to these archives and muck around in their stuff, although I am. But because I think democracy requires us to have access to records. Democracy requires us to have transparent records of what our government has collected over time. We need that. These are the records of our past. They are the records of our future. So I couldn't be more sympathetic to, and in fact, feeling empowered about the future of public archives. I think what the National Archives has done in trying to create a path towards more digitization of their records has been important. but state archives, there's just not enough to say about how important they are. Last question about big projects versus small projects. I also included on that slide the South Carolina Historical Society, because they have just done, and because I'm working on a project that looks for family histories written in the 18th century, and those are pretty scarce, and they were weirdly cataloged up until relatively recently. I'm constantly kind of surfing around, all these places to see who's got something digitized. And it's really interesting to see the materials that they have chosen to digitize, and they've done a really nice job with them. And in fact, I've been working with some plantation records that they've just put online. But I think what the potential for smaller collections is in collaborative work with researchers. The OI has a relatively small fellowship that we grant for researchers working collaboratively with a specific library or collection. And it has to be a joint application to support digitization, which will then be publicly available. But the win for the collection is that they get a little bit of money towards this very expensive process of digitization. And they also know it's going to be used right away. They know that this is something that is going to have impact because someone is going to take it up, write about it, share about it. So there will be use. And of course, we know archivists, librarians, what do you want more than to have people using stuff and put it out in the world, right? So I think the potential for collaboration with researchers, thinking about both instructing researchers about the kind of longer workflow and understanding it, but also in helping to prioritize digitization is, there's enormous potential there.
Great, thanks, Karin. We have time for about one more question. We've got a handful of questions that have come in, and I want to remind people that Karin will be on our panel tomorrow, and some of these questions will be, I will keep track of them and we can bring them up over the coming days because some of them will tie to the discussion that our panelists are having tomorrow and on Thursday. I want to end though, Karin, by giving you an opportunity to respond to the first question that came through, which says, thanks for the great talk. And as you reflect on the development of the Georgian Papers program in recent years, what are some of the concepts you've learned or methodologies you've encountered since its inception that you wish you could have applied at the project's beginning?
Gosh, so I have a very an answer that sounds dull, but I think is truthful. And I'm sorry for giving long answers, so we can't do too many questions. But one of those is simply about project management. This is a collaboration that works across the pond, as it were. King's College London, William and Mary, the Royal Collection Trust, and the Omohundro Institute, 4 very differently situated institutions. And collaboration requires exquisitely attuned management and communication. And that is, gosh, it is really hard. For any of you who ever read Michael Lewis's great book, The Fifth Risk, about the disasters out there that are lurking within our federal agencies, as the federal government gets depleted, one of his points is that the difference between success and failure can come down to management. So that's a rather, it might come across as a dull answer, but it's really, really true. That strong management. And we, the Georgian Papers has been a marvelous project, and I am not in any way suggesting that somehow we, but we didn't set up structures ahead of time for our collaboration. And I think collaborative workflow is a real challenge here that is going to take some engineering at the level of attention as digitization. I mean, you guys know what the workflow is like to take your stuff from, out of their boxes into conservation, imaging, and so on and so on. But we need workflow for collaboration as well. But the other thing that I am always reminded about with the Georgian Papers is that there is a nearly endless public appetite for good history. And that, while one might think that the things people would be most interested in would be, a fancy signature from George III or a Queen Charlotte's diary, whatever, people are really hungriest for the highest quality interpreted information we give them.
Great, thank you, Karin. And that's actually that answer was perfect because that's a nice pivot to what we'll talk about next. So I want to thank you for, again, a great keynote and for framing this discussion we're going to have that's really going to extend over the next 3 days. And I will shift gears then. So I'll thank you on behalf of the audience and everyone else.
Thank you, everyone.
And I want to shift gears and turn things over to several of my colleagues at Harvard Library. So thinking about what Karin just said about successes or the importance of management here, I want to turn this over to 4 colleagues, each of whom has played a key role both in conceptualizing and realizing this project, the Colonial North America project, over the past decade. This project, as many of us know, has a vastness of its own, spanning now the better part of a decade, with many staff members at Harvard Library contributing their expertise over the years. There were hundreds of key decision points, some related to the vision of this project, to its purpose and long-term viability, as well as innumerable decisions about matters practical and technical. We're going to spend most of the next couple of days thinking about the future of the Colonial North America project, but we would be remiss to not spend a bit of time now reflecting on the past as well. So our next presentation, titled The Genesis and Impact of an Idea, will feature 4 speakers who will offer us some insights into not only what Colonial North America at Harvard Library is, but why it exists in the first place, and how it went from an ambitious idea to a robust open platform for researchers across the world to access these important materials. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our 4 speakers who will speak in turn. Megan Sniffen-Marinoff, University Archivist at Harvard University. Francisca Frey, Chief of Staff and Senior Advisor for University Library Strategy, Planning and Assessment. Suzanne Wuns, Associate University Librarian for Discovery and Access. And Claire DeMarco, Interim Head of Information and Technical Services and Associate Director for UX and Strategy at Harvard Library. So I will now turn it over to Megan, Francisca, Suzanne, and Claire.
Thank you, Ross, very much. And good morning, everyone. As the slide indicates, my name is Megan Sniffen-Marinoff. I'm University Archivist at Harvard, and I've been working on the overall management and curatorial side of the Colonial North America project since its inception. After roughly a decade of work, the project has finally reached the point where we are really ready for prime time. So what is CNA at Harvard Library, as we'll probably continue to call it a little bit today? What we plan to describe briefly for you today is a project that led to the digitization of a very wide range of objects. The focus of our work has been on unpublished manuscripts and archives representing the 17th and 18th centuries and related to North America. As this project concludes, we have now digitized, as we've said, over 700,000 pages. From the beginning, our goal was not to limit access to these materials to the Harvard community, nor to wait until the end of the project to make them available. We linked the objects to Harvard's open library catalogs and finding aids all along as we worked. We also brought them together in a specially designed website to make them easier to find in one place. Together, these items are an accumulation of materials that Harvard has been amassing since its founding in 1636, as it both created and collected documents. The materials extend beyond North America, and with evolving curated features on the website, we aim to bring out some of the surprising content, much of which remained relatively hidden from view for far too long. Next slide, please. As Robert Darnton has noted, this is an important project with a goal of making freely available what we found. And from the beginning, our goal was to digitize everything we could find. There was no cherry picking. There was no hand selection of special items. We digitized not just what we may have found interesting. And for that reason, you might find items from the late 16th or early 19th centuries in this collection. If a group of materials, such as correspondence between individuals, began before the 17th or continued beyond the end of the 18th century, we made sure to not lose the thread of that context for researchers. So we let the project boundaries blur around the edges. Next slide, please. So what will you find here? The collections at Harvard are very much a reflection of the teaching and research interests of people associated over time with Harvard. The materials represent a range of interests from the arts and humanities to the social sciences and hard sciences. They were collected not only by Harvard College, the original college, but also by professional schools ranging from divinity to business, law to medicine. Let me show you a few more examples beyond those wonderful ones that Karin shared earlier. Next slide, please. There is what you might expect, documentation of the famous or the celebrated. For example, in a collection of autographs, you'll find a 1787 receipt from Paul Revere, acknowledging over 16 pounds paid to him for a silver teapot. Next slide. Or you will find messages or a fancy signature from George III, such as this one from the Court of St. James, September 10th, 1784. Next slide. But you will also find a document dated October 6, 1797, certifying that Charles Gavin was inoculated at the smallpox hospital in Shapley's Island, New Hampshire, on September 7, 1797. He was declared free of disease, attested to by Dr. William Cutter, a type of inoculation document increasingly familiar to us right now. The smallpox hospital on the island was established by the town of Portsmouth, New Hampshire in 1776. Next slide, please. In business records, you will find numerous references to women. For example, among the bills, receipts, orders, notes, bills of exchange, and ship's papers from Boston merchant Melatiah Bourne are bills for goods such as this accounting of flowers, beads, jewelry, and dry goods from Mary Damaris between March and August 1750. Next slide. Seen here is a northeast view of the house of Samuel Weber and of the courthouse in Cambridge, Massachusetts. This is the work of William Boyd, Harvard class of 1796. This drawing was part of his coursework, a thesis designed to demonstrate a student's mastery of one or more mathematical concepts by applying math to a problem in the real world, in this case, a survey. This is one of many such theses that include drawings that employ linear perspective. It has been suggested that these may be the earliest evidence of formal instruction in the use of perspective in North America. Next slide. For those with an interest in the law, there is this 1698 prenuptial agreement made by Luke Hayes to his future wife, Magdalene Freeman, a widow who owned property in Farmington, Connecticut. Luke disclaimed all rights to her estate except for the improvement of her lands. He further agreed that the estate be given to her son, James Street, when he reached the age of 21. Next slide, please. We find fleeting documents of youth. For example, this letter written by student John Hancock on May 1st, 1754 to his sister, Mary Hancock Perkins, asking her to please write more often. This personal letter by Hancock offers one of the earliest examples of this now well-known signature. Next slide, please. Especially in the earliest years of the university, religious studies and research were common and represented by large numbers of materials across Harvard's libraries. For example, a Mexican catechism, possibly from the 17th century, in Testerian hieroglyphs, or the pictorial writing system that was used until the 19th century to teach Christian doctrine to the indigenous peoples of Mexico. Next slide, please. Closer to home is a collection of hymns in the Delaware language, dated somewhere between 1779 and 1806, and attributed to David Zeisberger. It was intended for the use of the Christian Indians of the Mission of the United Brethren in North America. This is part of a collection of hymns, sermons, speeches, and other religious works in Delaware, gathered or produced by Moravian missionaries in Ohio. Next slide, please. Data abounds in the collection, some of which provides details on both free and enslaved Black Americans. For example, seen here in a folded leaf containing a chart, bills of mortality for 10 years in Cambridge, in Harvard scientist Professor John Winthrop's hand, listing the number of deaths by month for 1759 to 1768 and the chief causes of mortality. On this chart, Winthrop distinguished the list of deaths for each year, not only by age and gender, but also by race, both white and Black Americans found at bottom. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, there is broad geographic representation and also languages among the materials. For example, this drawing from the harbor of Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, about 1780, with a depiction of Fort Massey, which was built between 1776 and 1778. Next slide, please. Or this 1796 example in Arabic of a treaty with Tripoli from the papers of the American poet and statesman Joel Barlow, in this case related to his work on a mission to Algiers. Next slide. So how do we get there? How do we get here? How do we get from the idea for a project to completion? There were different stages of this work shown here, some of which happened at the start and some of which carried on in a continuous cycle over 8 years. Initially, this project began with a focus on Harvard in the 17th and 18th centuries, and one that surveyed, processed, conserved, and digitized all of the objects at the Harvard University archives. And I should point out here that when it first started, when it was established, Harvard was actually a public institution supported by the colony. As we worked on this project, Professor Darnton's interest grew into a project to look across the whole library system for similar materials, and he commissioned a one-year survey to locate documents across the dozens and dozens of Harvard's libraries. The survey noted items in online catalogs and finding aids, and many card and paper indexes never converted to online access. The work required on-site visits, conversations with archivists and curators, and the opening of many closets and backroom file cabinets. Next slide, please. We discovered over the years far more than we anticipated finding at the start, nearly double the amount, in fact. In the end, we located materials in 15 different libraries. In many respects, the individual libraries were like working across independent organizations in the same city, all with different histories, different resources, and is not uncommon among libraries collecting for centuries, different standards of description applied over decades, if not centuries. The libraries were separated by miles and even a river. If we were to proceed, safe transportation of documents was an early issue to assess and address. If we were going to be able to take on the work of digitization of all we found, we recognized early on that we needed to work at scale. We hired a roving archivist who, working in conjunction with local staff, went from library to library, processing collections in a way that, with additional analysis, improved access, whether that was enhancing catalog records or finding aids or the creation of new tools. And for next steps, I turn this over to Franziska Frey.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Franziska Frey, Chief of Staff for Harvard Library. And I joined the CNA project team shortly after joining Harvard Library in 2011, at the time as Head of Preservation and Imaging. Next slide, please. One of the first tasks at that time was to create a strategic plan for the project, describing processes and resource needs to digitize all collections. And as Megan just mentioned, we found more materials as we went along with the project. And I just would like to quote Bob Darnton here. After commissioning a detailed survey of manuscripts related to the colonial period and gaining insights into the scope of the collections, we developed a strategic plan to process, catalog, preserve, digitize, and store these important manuscripts. Next slide, please. As part of the plan, we created workflows that were scalable, partly because not all funding was secured at the beginning of the project, and we had to adapt to that. And of course, because of the amount of materials that had to be digitized. A very important step was also to collaborate with colleagues from all participating repositories to come to an agreement to use the same practices and workflows for all materials. We developed best practices for processing, as Megan already mentioned, image stabilization and conservation, material preparation, and imaging, with the goal to ensure that we only spend the minimal time necessary on each object. Colleagues in the Weizmann Preservation Center developed and refined novel repair techniques, making it possible to stabilize a large amount of materials in a relatively short period of time. Given the age of the collections, a number of common conservation issues were of course encountered: iron gall ink deterioration, some mold damage, fire damage, brittle papers, and material loss. We also developed a new approach to material review, conducting the review by conservation and imaging specialists at the same time. This approach proved to be very successful, minimizing time colleagues in the various repositories needed to spend on this step, since they only needed to pull materials once. It also helped with planning for the various teams, including transportation logistics. Next slide, please. We are fortunate to have a variety of imaging workflows available in our Imaging Services Lab at Harvard Library. And all along, the team was striving to use the best suited and cheapest workflows possible. Two steps were enabling the move to faster and cheaper workflows: image stabilization and consistent preparation of the materials before going to the camera. The imaging workflows used are in close alignment with national and international standards, with the goal of creating images that match the originals in tone, color, and appearance. As you browse through the CNA holdings, I hope you enjoy the quality of the digitized materials. Let me close in thanking everybody who worked on this project. It would not have been possible without your dedication and perseverance. And I'm handing over now to Suzanne Wunz.
Thank you, Francisca, and I'll start by echoing those thanks to all of the staff who were involved. It was really a massive project, and amazing contributions were made across the entire organization to make it possible. And the workflows that Francisca described really allowed us to keep digitizing content over the course of the decade that Megan described. And with those 15 different repositories contributing content, since we had those workflows in place, we could just keep adding them to that pipeline as people discovered new content. After that initial survey, it was sort of stunning as we started the project that more and more materials came to light as we went. And so really did allow us to build up this enormous corpus, which is just such a wonderful research collection now. So just wanted to mention that. I joined the project in 2015 when I accepted a role as Director of Digital Strategies and Innovation for the Harvard Library. And sort of my first task in that role was to develop a written digital strategy plan for the library. And that meant that I spent the first 6 months or so of 2015 talking to a ton of people, talking to our researchers, talking to librarians who worked with those researchers, to really try to articulate all of the needs that they had in using the library content, and particularly in using our content in a digital way. And so from that, can we advance the next slide, please? We learned that the user expectations for working with our digital content were really to do real research with the content. While we were linking the digital objects to finding aids from the beginning and to catalog records, we were hearing from our users that they really did want to conduct research across the collection. So having a full set that would get the new images regularly so that there was always a refresh, and that they could search using different facets from our metadata, so location, date, etc. Date and location were kind of the two that came out most often. And then, the sort of personalized features that a lot of people had come to expect by then in terms of saving searches, saving documents, etc., so that they could really create their own little research existence within our larger open platform was a goal for the researchers. So to build that really rich research experience for our users, I personally was very glad that we were going to get the chance to have this huge collection to work with so that we could experiment with some new technologies, learn from the process, and then build on that for future digital collections and platforms. But that first priority was creating the robust open platform that, as Ross described it, where users could engage with the content, see what research was possible, and make their own discoveries. So Karin, thank you for illuminating the importance of that work and the sort of exciting possibilities that archives like this make possible. And then during the project to build the current site, we were able to put into place a lot of the search options that our users requested. Could we get the next slide, please? So this is an example of what a search reaction looks like in the current site. Of the user expectations, keyword searching was the one that we weren't able to launch with. We did make it possible to do keyword searching of the metadata that described the collections, but for the vast majority of the items, we didn't have transcripts or OCR text to work with to enable keyword searching of the documents themselves. But if you come back tomorrow, you can hear about how we've been able to make progress on that goal during this pandemic year, which is pretty exciting. But in the meantime, I'm going to hand it off to Claire DeMarco, who entered the project as a project manager to help us build and launch the current research site. So Claire, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thanks, Suzanne. So as Suzanne talked about, we wanted to begin from a place of meeting user needs. And one method for doing that is articulating user stories around the different functions and experiences that people want to have with the site. And that was a really key component as we started building out a website that we wanted to return to. And I'm happy to say, in terms of starting off with the bookend, that that's exactly the type of feeling that we've heard in terms of feedback from users. So on the next slide, we have a quote: "Words can't describe how meaningful this project has been to me. I'm constantly finding materials involving my patrilineal ancestors on your website. It's ridiculously thrilling. Sitting on my couch last night, I discovered a mid-17th century ledger book, including entries on my 8th and 9th great-grandfathers purchasing cloth from a Newbury, Mass. Fulling mill in the 1670s. This scenario happens to me every time I'm on your site. For a history buff, this is too good to be true." Now, obviously, we selected a great piece of feedback to share today, but this quote gets at a few things we wanted to keep in mind when we were approaching the project. Harvard Library users, whatever that phrase means, we know it's a diverse group of sophisticated researchers who are sophisticated in distinct ways. Not always in a traditional academic mindset, but that have their own rich research needs and desires. But if we could rely on universal design principles, we'll make it easier for everyone. So when you are creating a project like this, where your intended audience is the world, you really need to keep the diversity of perspectives in mind and really get to that universal design approach. And that approach extends to the way we think about ourselves. So users know that Harvard has stuff, to use the technical term, but where is the stuff? And what about the name of a particular repository indicates anything about their collecting focus? As we saw here, we're looking at, in this quote about purchasing cloth. Were these materials from Baker in a business context? Was this something from the archives? There's not necessarily a link between those two things. So searching across collections was a key feature from the beginning. We wanted a robust and performant search index that could include that key metadata. across. And that's part of what Francisco was talking about with the consistent practices, because these are coming from so many different repositories with different descriptive practices over time. We wanted to make sure we could search in the broadest possible terms. We also were building a site while we were still digitizing, as was mentioned. So providing access while digitizing helped us to understand how people would interact with the material. So not just their stated desires about searching, but how else would they navigate these curated features and other specific means of interacting with the material. So the next slide. So were we creating a virtual exhibit or a digital collection? And the answer is both. We didn't create a single front door. We wanted an easy front door. The home page has the search right up at the top, but it is curated. It puts the unique attributes of these materials at the forefront. And we got feedback from users that they wanted to quickly get to the digital images of items in this collection, either by search or by navigation. So that was critical to the success of the site as a whole. How to discover a collection of collections. So I'm making an assumption that most people on this call have experienced this troublesome word, collection, and what does it mean, and what is a collection when you interact with it. We needed to figure out a way to help users navigate archival processing in a digital interface. And remember, we're talking about 2015, 2016. So in order to create that search and discovery level that had both collection level metadata and item level metadata, we had to think really creatively. Not all collection level metadata is accurate at an item level, but we wanted to show and explain how the materials are connected. That's an important data point, but it can be a barrier. And a barrier to that kind of novel search, new initiatives trying to look across lines that were siloed before. So the key to the stewardship of these digital experiences was that we needed to rely on infrastructure that we could build and grow together. So we've heard about the pipeline for digitization and the importance of establishing that at Harvard, but we also wanted to have a new framework for sharing, not just within the archival research community, but in that another kind of broad and varied community, which is kind of cultural humanities, cultural heritage institutions, the technology that is supporting those institutions. So using interoperable international standards, IIIF is our image framework. Blacklight and Spotlight are the pieces of software that enable this work. So the next slide will take a peek under the hood. So starting with Spotlight, Spotlight is the content management system, or CMS, that is based on Blacklight. So Blacklight is the search and discovery interface that had been used already for lots of library catalogs, and Stanford had created a virtual exhibit layer on top of that that would allow for both this deep search and discovery and these kind of curated experiences that were much like an exhibit. So the idea here is that the Harvard Library user is but one audience. We wanted to be working in a framework that would also allow us to connect with other cultural heritage institutions and use a like-minded technology language so that we can fulfill the ultimate goal of having these things be truly open and interconnected with one another beyond just Harvard, beyond our own little city, as Megan pointed out that we started with, but broadening beyond. That customized user interface, though, was really important to meet the moment and the kind of breadth and scale of what we were doing at Harvard, to say this requires its own user interface because it is something that we have never successfully done before within our own community, to normalize and bring in metadata about individual items and collections at scale, and to have those digital images right there and easily available. So the underpinning is this other piece of technology that then we've been able to use, as Suzanne pointed out, for broader digital collections work, which is API access to all of these records that are aggregated. So our catalog records, the archival finding aid component parts, our image records, and then the original metadata that was created at the point of digitization that gives us that sense that this is all part of one set, the CNA, or as we're expanding the name, that dedicated set. And we're really excited to see what the future of presenting metadata in that format will be, because again, we can see a lot of interconnectedness that will go across not only the individual silos of the repositories, but then broaden and allow for opportunities to research in new ways. A quick point about analytics that I wanted to share just as preparing for this today. We've seen over 62,000 users of the site viewing 160,000 different pages since the launch. That's about an average between 1,500 and 3,000 users a month that are interacting with 2 to 3 pages per session. So for those of you who are interested in building user interfaces, you know that getting people to click in between different records demonstrates an interest and an engagement with the material that we want. That was an important part of our goal here. 65% of our users come through an organic search. So while it's important for us to have hooks to our catalog, have hooks to our finding aids, have social and have events like this that will hopefully get certain things trending, it's really important to realize that this was a way to get directly to meet users where they are in doing a broad search on the web and having people come through that method, which is not necessarily kind of germane to library instruction, where we point people to the catalog first. So this was a really new endeavor for us, and we're really excited at how much it has enabled us to build on it to develop things like the Curiosity digital collections, Harvard digital collections, and many more things to come. So I'll turn it back over to Ross for questions that may have inspired in all of you.
Thanks, Claire, and thank you to Suzanne, Francisca, and Megan as well. We do have some questions that have come in, and I want to start with one that kind of bridges the two discussions we've had, starting with Karin's talk and then into this panelist discussion. So Karin, you should also feel free to join this discussion if you feel like it. This question says, thank you for acknowledging the community effort in building digital collections. When we personify the archive or disembodied institutions as having agency to silence or speak, we run the risk of erasing the labor of actual archivists and librarians. How has Worlds of Change, or other projects you admire, made the labor involved in building digital collections more visible to scholars and wider public audiences?
I don't know if Megan wants to weigh in on this, but I know that when we did initially launch the site, that was one of the things that we thought about. And in our initial blog posting, we made sure to include pictures of the staff working on the process and listing all the numbers of all the people who had contributed to the labor involved. I think it is a really important point, and one that I thank you for asking that question so that we could raise it again right now.
Yeah, I could just jump in quickly just to follow up with Suzanne and say yes. And to point to Karin's remark earlier about how much of this is about project management and how important it is to coordinate. And I think as a result of this project, work that we all did individually behind the scenes became much more transparent to each of us along the way. It's about the world perhaps understanding how much we need to coordinate ourselves, but among ourselves, we also have really had to think hard about what each other person does, what their component in the project work is, and to really talk to each other and understand the challenges all along. So in an odd way, there are many outcomes of this project that really don't have anything to do with the website or all about the way we work, I think, going forward, and gaining a greater understanding of each other's expertise, I think, has been critical to the project.
Let me follow up on that quickly as well and echo that. I think it also led to a greater understanding and greater respect of the work that's involved. And I think one of the things that was really amazing for me, and I think everybody who was involved in this to see, is really doing this at scale it's one thing to work on a small project where you have 10,000 pages, but just continue to work on it, and you see you reach 100,000, 200,000, 300,000 pages, and just stay with it and see the dedication of the staff, the new things they developed, the new processes they developed was really amazing to see. And also, thank you for this question. I think that's something we could probably do still a little bit more on the website, is really highlight all the work that goes into making such a project happen.
Ross, I just wanted to add one quick thing and say, first of all, appreciation for these incredible presentations, which really I feel like I have a much richer appreciation for the site itself, even though I feel like I've been a pretty continual user, an enthusiast, even a user of the sticker for over a year now, I think. But I think you know, that image that I talked about of the researcher waiting in the reading room for the cart to be rolled out, like all the magic is happening behind the door, and the cart just appears, and there it is. And it's like, you know, keeping that stuff separate and anonymous and invisible, I think, is not a great idea. I understand exactly why it works, and it was lovely in my experience in lots of ways. It was all magic. But revealing the nature of the work and the collaborative nature and the different kinds of expertise that are required, I think, is such a gift of this project, the things that you have all talked about. And although I haven't been everywhere on the site, even just on the about page, I mean, I know I'm a little nerdy in this respect, but I would love to see a kind of gesture to telling people about this process.
Yeah, I would add, I think that would be amazing. I work with classes a lot at Harvard, and this is something where I use the CNA and other platforms like it, and questions increasingly come up about the technical aspects of this and the preservation aspects, about what processes do these documents go through before they appear on somebody's screen. So I do think we've done quite a bit of programming around those processes, but there's still plenty more to do to highlight that work. We've got time for a few more questions, and I want to turn to one that says, in what ways did the digitization process and the production of descriptions, metadata, the production of descriptions and metadata involve creating or reaffirming relations with Indigenous communities for their expertise and knowledge?
I can jump in on this one, Ross. Honestly, at the beginning of the project, we didn't really know how much we had or where it was. And because we found some early materials at the Harvard University archives that related to Harvard's specific relationship with Indigenous communities as it was being founded, we were able to, as a fellow on this project, work with a speaker who was actually going to be present tomorrow, Stephen Curley, who at the time was the archivist for the Wampanoag in our area. And that was a group that Harvard connected to very early on. And we were able to meet with Stephen several times, actually, before he became a fellow, to talk a little bit about what Harvard had, what the Wampanoag did not have in their archive, how we could share. Stephen spent some time transcribing materials for us as well. So we were able to benefit early on with some connection with that community. And as time went on, and we began to talk a little bit more about what we were finding, the Yale Indian Project folks reached out to us and asked us if we could include some of our materials in their project. And that was a project that very clearly was working with a variety of different communities. And so indirectly, we were able to get some input on our materials. I think we have a lot more work to do now that we know what we have. And one of the, we are sort of saying that the project is concluded, but we all among ourselves say it's never done. So I fully expect that we'll be able to benefit now from some outreach to those communities, definitely in enhancing the metadata that we have.
Thanks, Megan. I have a question probably best answered by Claire, although many people could probably chip in on this. Claire, you talked about this a little bit, but maybe you can expand. Can you comment on considerations of collaboration for providing access versus developing your own individual platform?
Yeah, sure. And I appreciate this question. I have to admit, at the time, I was not in the right camp. At the time that I came onto the project, I wanted to make the coolest website for us that I possibly could. I was out there trying to make something that really worked for Harvard. But very early on, I'm talking within a month on the project, I benefited from the deep expertise in our library technology services group in knowing the value of partnering with open source software communities and really enabling not only the software we were relying upon, but as I said, the frameworks for sharing the images that we were using to again, speak the language that was becoming much more common in the cultural heritage technology space. And so that groundwork and that learning that I did on the job, it led us in a direction where now we can look for some of these integrations that if we had gone a different way early on would have been precluded for us. So things like making our the API feed that we have, turning that into a harvestable data set by aggregators, working with transcription partners to then have transcriptions eventually appear as IIIF annotations. And if those are things that are not familiar to you, trust me when I say that that is where we're headed. There are many institutions that are already there. And so we can benefit from their expertise and we can be a model of maybe some things that are working with smaller sets of material or in more boutique collections. If we can scale it with this collection, then that opens the door for true interoperability across those institutional lines. So that's an area of growth that I think we all benefited from, the flexibility and agility of this project to learn as we were growing it and to see the benefits there.
Thanks, Claire. As we get close on time, I want to have one sort of final question, and there are a few more questions in the chat, and like the questions for Karin, I'm keeping track of them and we'll try to get them integrated into the programming over the coming days as well, because I think this conversation is going to continue. I want to have this last question for the whole panel. The first part of it, Claire kind of just addressed, but the second part I don't think has been addressed and is really interesting. What is the next logical step for CNA? More institutions or broadening the time frame? So this is a question I have myself. What about a 19th century project or beyond?
So I can jump in first and say that quietly over the course of a year, we did a survey of the 19th century collections at Harvard. It is, when we use the word vast today, this is vast. And the CNA project is just a drop in the bucket of what there is from the 19th century that Harvard can pursue in the future. And we certainly, because of its size, do not have the level of detail that we have, that we had to begin this project. But I certainly think that we may approach it differently based on what we've learned. But continuing to digitize materials, I think, remains a very high priority for all the reasons that Karin explained in her talk. So at least from that perspective, I would say that's part of the future.
And of course, bringing forward what we learned with CNA, there are different materials, different time frame. That means there will be different conservation issues as we move forward. But many of the things we learned with CNA will help whenever we move forward into the 19th century.
I think from my own observations that Claire's point about the sort of open nature of these and the interoperability of this platform is really exciting, because I do see Colonial North America, Worlds of Change as we now know it, connecting to these projects that Karin, some of them that she suggested that are big aggregators that bring together all this material under various framings. And I think that CNA is going to have a place in those, and I'm excited to see what that reveals for researchers going forward. So we're about at time, and I want to thank everybody again, thank the audience especially for joining us today on the first day of our 3-part symposium. And before we end, I want to give you all a brief preview about what's to come on the remaining days. I, of course, want to thank Karin for her keynote speech and for our panelists as well. So tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern, we will have our first panel discussion, or our second following this one, titled Beyond Digitization. Beyond the Reading Room. As you might be able to deduce from the title, we're going to be shifting away from thinking about the history of this huge digitization project, and instead look to a panel of experts to help us think about how these materials are fueling advances in teaching and learning, in community building and cultural survival, and more generally in shifting our ideas about colonial America. We are very excited to have historian Vincent Brown chairing or moderating that panel. And I'll introduce Vince in more detail tomorrow, but suffice it to say for now that he will undoubtedly bring to the conversation his expertise about the colonial period and Atlantic world, as well as his significant experience with multimedia and digital analysis and storytelling. Vince will be joined by a group of archivists and historians, including an encore appearance by Karin Wulf. On Thursday, also at 11 a.m. Eastern, we will kick off our final day with another panel, this one titled Seeing at Scale, Artificial Intelligence and Access to Manuscript Materials. We've got a great lineup of panelists for that session as well, several of whom are engaged in large-scale projects that use artificial intelligence or machine learning to view, analyze, and interpret digitized manuscripts en masse. Our panelists are interested in not only the many individual stories within these huge collections, but also what we can see if we step back and with the aid of algorithms, look at the collections as a whole. The technical complexities of these approaches are equaled by their ethical implications. So our discussion will also involve critiques of this type of computer-aided research. Thursday's panel will be moderated by Stu Sneidman, the Associate University Librarian and Managing Director of Library Technology here at Harvard. We'll close out our program on Thursday afternoon with a special visit from Jeffrey Page and Diane Paulus. Jeffrey and Diane are the co-directors of the American Repertory Theater's revival of the musical 1776. Revival, I think, probably doesn't do it justice. Jeffrey, Diane, the cast and crew have really re-envisioned the show, building an experience that more closely aligns with our modern concerns as Americans. Diane and Jeffrey will talk to us briefly about what 1776, the show, is communicating to its audience, and what 1776, the year, the event, continues to communicate to us hundreds of years later. So thank you all again for coming today. Thank you, Karin, for your thoughtful keynote. Thank you to our panelists, and we will look forward to seeing everyone tomorrow at 11 Eastern.